Hello bookworms, I'm Hannah, and this is part 3 of my Bailey's Women's Prize video series in which I review all 16 of the books that were longlisted for this year's prize. If you missed parts 1 and 2 of this series, I'll provide a link to those videos down below. All of the Bailey's books I've reviewed up to this point are ones that I personally could have gone without reading and went on to live a happy and fulfilling life. From this point forward, I'm reviewing longlist books that I'm glad, or in some cases thrilled, that I picked up. I've been making my way through the long list in order from least to top favorite, so without further ado, let's dive into number 8, The Essex Serpent by Sarah Perry. This is a work of historical fiction with gothic undertones about a young widow named Cora Seaborn who abandons her life in London to explore coastal Essex, where she hears a rumor about a mythical serpent taking the lives of villagers further up the estuary. Let's start by talking about Cora Seaborn because she is my favorite part of this book. I tend to favor female protagonists who boldly break with convention, and that nicely summarizes Cora. The story takes place in the late 19th century, so Cora, being outspoken about her scientific mind, makes her an unorthodox, eccentric woman for her time. She readily abandons her society life in favor of donning men's clothing and getting muddy while wandering the estuary in search of fossils. When Cora hears the rumor of the mythical Essex Serpent, she's driven by an insatiable curiosity to learn more, which leads her to make the acquaintance of William Ransom, the stalwart, handsome, and uncompromising priest of Aldwinter. Cora has an interest in natural history and believes the snake is real. William thinks the snake is nothing more than a myth and has no patience for what he deems godless superstition. So between these two characters, we get a juxtaposition of science versus religion, which remains a running theme throughout the entire book. The Essex Serpent is over 400 pages long, and I could have spent 400 pages reading about Cora and her complicated friendship with and unsanctioned attraction to William, who, by the way, is married, drama, but the book explores several other character subplots that portray the demands of friendship, the perils of love, and explore the ethical principles of practicing medicine, but I think those subplots distract from Cora and make the book feel convoluted and overlong. As it stands, if about 100 pages of extraneous stories about secondary characters were cleaved from this book, I believe I'd have liked it a whole lot more. I'm really glad I own this copy, however, because I suspect I'll reread this book in the future, and I think I'll like it more on a second go-around because of its delightful protagonist and gothic flourishes of romance, death, and Victorian morality. I wish the horror aspect of traditional gothic novels had been more prevalent in this book, particularly where the Essex Serpent is concerned. I won't say too much because I don't want to spoil the book for you, but I will say that if you go into this book anticipating a gruesome and harrowing tale, like I did, you will be sorely disappointed. To conclude, a progressive, self-confident female protagonist steals the show in this charming book that is, unfortunately, bloated with repetitive subplots. Coming in at number 7 is First Love by Gwendolyn Riley, a contemporary women's novel about a 33-year-old woman named Neve who recounts the corrosive relationships of her past to better understand her inability to leave her toxic marriage to an abusive man named Edwin. At just 166 pages, Riley takes a minimalist approach to this narrative, which is the source of most of my problems with this book. Because of its brevity, there's no room for character development or story arc. Also, the story moves forward and backward through time, and even though it's short, I still struggled to orient myself whenever the timeline suddenly shifted. Nonetheless, I like this book for its writing merit. So what do I mean by that? First, the dialogue is superlative. All of it feels natural and conversational to such a degree that Riley uses very few dialogue tags because she doesn't need to. And second, Riley succeeds in setting a scene with very few words. There are some books on the long list whose writing felt verbose, so this was a nice change of pace. And third, this book gives a strikingly accurate portrayal of how gut-wrenching and claustrophobic abusive relationships can be. Edwin's caustic verbal abuse, his passive-aggressive tendencies, his unpredictable temper, and the way he effectively twists Neve's words make him a quintessential example of a psychologically manipulative person. Neve has a few moments of reflection that are provocative, so even though this book is short, the main character accomplishes a degree of self-discovery. I think a lot of people were miffed to see this book earn a spot on the shortlist. I don't necessarily agree that it deserves to be there, especially when comparing it to other books on the long list, but I can understand, given how much Riley accomplishes in so few pages, how it wound up there. Bottom line, the author makes up for this book's brief, fragmentary narrative with sharp writing and superb dialogue. Moving on, we get to number 6, Little Deaths by Emma Flint, which is a literary thriller based on a true story. It takes place in Queens, New York in 1965 and follows Ruth Malone, a single mother who becomes the prime suspect in the case of her missing children. There are some hefty tomes on the long list, and I freely admit that one of the reasons I enjoyed this book so much is because I was able to consume it in its entirety in one day. But there's a whole lot more to like about this book, namely its deceptive characters and Flint's exemplary writing style. Let's start with the characters and then I'll touch on the writing. Ruth is a good time girl. She is a cocktail waitress with a penchant for getting laid. She's an excellent model of a sympathetic character because she is a working single mom whose circumstances are agonizing and unfair. Ruth is not the type of woman or mom society expected women to be at the time when the story takes place, so she is subjected to endless amounts of prejudice and sexism. The police and Ruth's neighbors immediately accuse her of being guilty just because she's unconventional, so there's a natural inclination to be on her side. She also appears genuinely distraught by what's happened to her children. In fact, the moments where she clings to memories of her little ones and attempts to wrangle her grief are painful and hard-hitting. But Ruth is also an example of a character who easily garners dislike. Her alcohol dependency blurs her memory and makes her testimony irritatingly unreliable. As far as being quote-unquote villainous goes, as we're first getting to know Ruth, she doesn't kick any dogs, but she does neglect to feed her whimpering dog, which struck me as a sly nod to an old trope. The story also follows Peter Warnke, a tabloid reporter for the Herald who's looking for a big story to make his career. Peter gets caught up in the investigation because of a developing infatuation with Ruth, so when he uncovers evidence that's vital to the case, his fixation clouds his judgment. Earlier I mentioned Flint's writing, and that's because even the smallest details, like the application of makeup or a child's gaze, are described in ways both sensory and poetic. Flint maintains this writing style throughout the book, allowing for instances where the mundane is made resplendent. Had she been too heavy-handed with these lyrical descriptions, the book would have swelled to the point of gluttony, but instead, she maintains a delicate balance from start to finish. On that subject, I really appreciated the alluring portrayals of desire in this book. If my sardonic review of The Lesser Bohemians revealed one thing about me, it's that I am not entertained by blunt force, gratuitous sex scenes. I prefer authors who can convey sensuality in subtle but heated ways. Back to the story of Ruth, the stakes are raised when police make a horrifying discovery about her children just a few chapters in, and that was the moment that cemented my interest in reading this book in one sitting. Even though the book is not overly suspenseful, I never stopped wondering if Ruth was a guilty, unreliable narrator, and questioning, if it turns out it wasn't her, then who and why? To summarize, Little Deaths is a satisfying page-turner. The last book for today is Stay With Me by Ayobami Ado. Whoa! Did you see how the light just changed? Light, dark, wow. Some things just can't be helped. At last, we arrive at a book whose placement on the shortlist I completely agree with. This story takes place in Nigeria and follows a woman named Yejide whose marriage hinges on her getting pregnant. But it seems she's incapable of conceiving, so she resorts to drastic high-risk measures in hopes of having a baby. I want to begin by talking about plot pacing because in the opening pages of this book, Adebayo drops readers right into the central drama. By establishing the stakes early, my interest was piqued, and I immediately connected with Yejide because her emotional plight was made clear right from the get-go. Adebayo maintains a keen awareness of plot pacing throughout the entire book. She drops thrilling revelations at perfectly placed intervals to hold her reader's interest. I cared about those revelations because I was invested in the characters. The story alternates between the first-person perspective of Yejide and her husband Akin. By the way, I have no idea if I'm saying these character names right, so I apologize if I am just butchering them. Yejide's pain is expressed eloquently, conveying her feelings of heartbreak, betrayal, and jealousy. She and her husband have been in love since they met in college, and she is the only wife he's taken, but her extended family is threatening to pair her husband with a second wife, a beautiful younger woman, if she fails to fulfill her obligation to have children. And it's not like she's rebelling against motherhood. Yejide desperately wants a baby. When we switch to Akin's chapters, we get a shocking alternate perspective that reveals the marriage between these two characters is even more complicated than we first imagined. Akin is eager for Yejide to get pregnant. He's just as willing to take drastic measures for her to conceive, though the avenues he takes are arguably more severe. This book explores themes of motherhood and fertility with sophistication. It doesn't shy away from uncomfortable truths, and it's laden with insightful perceptions about life and love. My final say? Stay With Me is an impressive debut novel that earned a well-deserved spot on this year's shortlist. That concludes part 3 of my Bailey's Women's Prize video series. If you've read any of today's books, let me know which ones and what you thought of them in the comments below. All that remains in this series are my top picks from the long list, 4 books I think everyone should consider reading. I'll begin discussing those books in my next video. Thanks, everybody!